brothers and sisters in the struggle for human dignity and freedom. I am here to represent the struggle that has gone on for 300 or more years, a struggle to be recognized as citizens in a country in which we were born. I have had about 40 or 50 years of struggle, ever since a little boy on the streets of Norfolk called me a nigger. I struck him back, and then I had to learn that hitting back with my fist one individual was not enough. It takes organization. It takes dedication. It takes the willingness to stand by and do what has to be done when it has to be done. A nice gathering like today is not enough. You have to go back and reach out to your neighbors who don't speak to you. And you have to reach out to your friends who think they are making it good and get them to understand that they, as well as you and I, cannot be free in America or anywhere else where there is capitalism and imperialism until we can get people to recognize that they themselves have to make the struggle and have to make the fight for freedom every day in the year, every year, until they win it. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the political, cultural, and socioeconomic crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. My name is Trevor Mehmet, here on a solo podcast. Before we begin, if you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/millennial-review. We have an enormous backlog of content and a new show each and every week. We have a Discord community you'll gain access to with a good balance between BSing about whatever's going on and discussing/debating serious political questions. I know we're all looking for some form of community, and our community is steadily growing on our Discord, and you joining us would obviously be a part of that growth process. So come talk to us about politics, policy, history, philosophy, dank memes, as well as gaining access to our bonus episodes and helping fund the whole project, which is to build a leftist media platform that can reach as many people as possible and spread the good word. Patreon.com/millennial-review. Recently, we got a message on social media asking us to do a podcast on a very simple topic. What is socialism? When I say simple here, I don't mean it's not complex. Of course it is. The way in which you organize an economy is one of the most complex topics there is. Think about the way capitalism has developed and how virtually nobody understands it across the board. You could dedicate your entire life to doing nothing but studying the capitalist economy and still struggle to understand every minute detail of butterfly spreads and callable bonds and credit default swaps and derivatives and how the global trade regime functions. The history of the United States is littered with examples of the Federal Reserve, which is staffed with people who obsessively study capitalist markets, acting inappropriately during times of economic instability. And the mission for socialists is even harder, because we have to apply economic principles from theory to the real world without a litany of real-world examples. Most of us want socialism to be global, so obviously we have no examples to point to of what a country like Cuba would look like if the United States didn't cut off its sugar exports and actively sabotage it from the day Castro took office. But even if our concern isn't global and you just want to see socialism take hold in the United States, you're creating an alternative reality. First off, it's a scale that's never been achieved before. The Soviet Union didn't have anywhere near the US economic might when it underwent revolution, and, in fact, for all the critiques of the Soviets, they were actually an incredible success in modernizing an economy. Russia went from a backwards peasant country with no power on the global stage to a fully industrialized superpower in the span of roughly 20 years. China's growth is a similar story. But even at the peak of the Soviet Union, they still weren't competitive with the sheer scale of the American economy. And most importantly, the United States wouldn't have to go through the industrialization phase if socialism were to come today. Something I don't think leftists bring up enough when we're being attacked and saddled with the atrocities of past totalitarian regimes is that a lot of these atrocities happened as an attempt to industrialize the economy. In Das Kapital, Karl Marx is applying his theory to Germany. And Das Kapital is a work of theory that was called scientific rather than utopian because it dealt in economics, i.e. the same way that we would call the theory of supply and demand under capitalism scientific because it has predictive powers. So this phrase, you almost certainly seen online, late-stage capitalism, is an idea channeling Marx, which says that capitalism has all these fundamental contradictions in its mode of production, including things that Marx predicted, like monopolies and the accumulation of wealth in an increasingly shrinking share of the ultra-wealthy. So as it reaches the height of its contradictions, it will collapse in on itself and the population will take control of the ownership of the means of production. That's obviously a very simplified version, but the point is that Russia was the last place that a revolution should have taken place. The same goes for China. A big part of the reason why Marxism-Leninism and Marxism-Leninism-Maoism exist is because Lenin and Mao had to fit Marxist theory to their situation in their countries, filled with peasants and agriculture rather than an industrial labor force and machines. In other words, they were far from late capitalist societies. That was a little bit ranty, as you all know I tend to be, but the point is that industrialization is supposed to happen before socialization, not the other way around. This makes imagining modern socialism in the United States a difficult task, and one completely without historical precedent. Capitalism and socialism are all about the mode of production, and we haven't yet seen a modern state shift its economy to a socialist mode of production. Okay, so back to the question at hand. I'm obviously not here to hash out the ins and outs of a socialist economy, though that is of course worth doing. I'm here to simply define what socialism is. Judging from some of the questions we have received, some of you are on board with socialism, but not that clear on what it is, or you may have trouble explaining it to others. And that's okay. You don't have to understand socialism to be a socialist. I really believe that. Other leftists will tell you otherwise, but I think they're both wrong and counterproductive. First of all, most people consider themselves capitalists and know absolutely nothing about capitalism. That's why there is a debate between the scientific socialist and the utopian socialist. It's perfectly fine to just think everyone should be equal, or that you should have a say in what you do at work every day, without understanding the labor theory of value. So please, don't feel shame if you don't have a grasp of theory, but you feel in your gut that the existence of billionaires is immoral. And fuck anyone who tries to exclude you for not reading books. That said, it should be your goal to learn more, of course, and to probe and see what you actually believe. And that's the purpose of this podcast. Hopefully this won't just be preaching to the choir, but will actually reach those of you who ask for a relatively straightforward explanation of what it means to be a socialist. And this is important because socialism represents the core of leftism. If leftism is a solar system, socialism is the sun around which it orbits. We all believe that workers should own the means of production as a starting point, and from there, things get tricky. Let's begin with defining current global economic paradigm, capitalism. As Richard Wolff argues, socialism is capitalism's shadow. As long as there is capitalism, socialism will exist for workers who strive for emancipation. But capitalism is multivariate and takes many different forms. Despite being very different countries with very different modes of production, the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia are all capitalist economies. So it helps to break down the basics. Where did capitalism come from? There's some dispute over when and where capitalism emerged, because of course these things aren't simple, don't happen overnight, and history isn't a linear progression. But capitalism's emergence came out of a system that preceded it, which was feudalism. In feudalism, society is arranged like a pyramid. At the top, you have kings. A step lower, you have nobles. Then knights who fight the wars, and finally peasants at the lowest rung who farm the land. Feudalism, as an economic system, was centrally planned. The distribution is determined by the king and planned by the nobles. The peasants make sure the knights are fed so that they can fight and defend the estates. Peasantry was sort of an evolution out of slavery. Rather than the slave doing all the work for someone else, the peasants did half the work for someone else. The most common feudal arrangement was peasants working 3 days on the land for their own benefit, 3 days working on the lord's land purely for the lord's benefit, and 1 day of rest. That day of rest, Sunday, was spent at the church worshiping because the Roman Catholic Church controlled the entire institution. Feudalism fell apart as an economic and political system for a number of reasons. Many knights went off to fight the Crusades, and the peasants escaped from their estates and to the towns because the knights weren't there to police them. Many knights were killed in the Crusades, weakening the peasant system as a whole as they were hard to replace. The knights who did make it back home often came home incredibly rich from having pillaged the East. You also had the Black Death, which wiped out a massive percentage of the population. This led to skepticism of religion on a mass scale for the first time, for understandable reasons. Why did God just allow half of your family to die? Further, of course massive death is going to disrupt the feudal arrangements, and more peasants began fleeing to the towns. As they did, they began doing different jobs to make a living, as you have to do when you're no longer on farmland. They made shoes and clothes and chairs and bows. These towns start growing pretty rapidly as the feudal estates become weaker and weaker. So the growing secularity, and by secularity, I don't mean atheism, I mean a political and economic structure that functions outside religious institutions, combined with a shift in the balance of power from feudal estates to growing towns and a diversifying of production, eventually led to what we call the market. The market is an arrangement in which exchanges are made by bartering. So rather than a peasant producing X bushels of grain that are then distributed through planting, people began trading their production. So it's not about how many mouths we have to feed, or who needs shoes, but rather what can you trade me for those shoes? I give you a dozen apples in exchange for a pair of slippers. We're bartering. But this is just a marketplace, and it's not inherent to capitalism. In fact, there are some leftists of the anarcho-syndicalist tradition who want to keep markets in a post-revolutionary society. Capitalism emerges when these markets start to scale. If you're a city in England defined by borders and interacting with one another through shared spaces, you obviously want to build an economy out of the marketplace. People bartering for shoes and food doesn't allow you to tax them and build an army or roads. The market needs to be organized. And this is really the fundamental premise of capitalism in its most distilled form. And the most important part of organizing the market is organizing labor. Which people do which job and for whose benefit. The labor needs to be divided. And with the emergence of capitalism, that division of labor became as free and mobile as it had ever been, which certainly would have been an attractive feature. In fact, the same arguments that were made by the capitalists at the time are still made today. They just work less well because we've advanced as a species and understand that it is built on a faulty premise and a better alternative exists. Because unlike slavery and feudalism, market arrangements allow one to transcend their birth. You're not born a slave or a serf. In fact, we don't assign you an economic class at all. So in theory, you have the freedom to become whatever you want. The rags to riches dream is built into a capitalist framework. And again, really think deeply about how great this sounds if you're the son of a peasant family. You don't have to work the land. You can instead go be a blacksmith. Another good way to think about this is to read the accounts of Black Americans who were writing at the end of slavery. You get a sense of almost giddy optimism that they now have an opportunity to make a life for themselves in the economy. And then, to me, perhaps the most powerful Black writing I've ever read is the generation of W.E.B. Du Bois coming to terms with the fact that freedom wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and that wage slavery is but a slight improvement over bondage. Capitalism very quickly scaled, and for obvious reasons. In an arrangement built on the exchange of goods, with growing populations where people are able to specialize, the economy becomes pretty dynamic. Obviously, this was not true under a feudal system, where specialization at scale was not a thing. This allows for the emergence of entrepreneurship, because there is no longer a lord determining every step of the production process. An ownership class arises and begins to make long-term investments with the capital that they've accumulated. Some of this initial ownership class were actually knights and their sons and grandsons who, although they were low on the feudalist totem pole, had brought back wealth from the Crusades, which became what we would call today startup capital. They start businesses with that capital and become bosses, which redefines production once again. Now laborers have to go to the capitalist bosses and ask for employment in order to afford the things they need in a diversified economy. Because now you need things, and the complexities of your needs grow as the complexity of the society you exist in grows. One of the primary ways in which this is the case is that you weren't housed by the master anymore, and you don't live outside of the town, so you have to find a place to live. And of course this is commodified with the enclosure movement, meaning you have to pay rents to a landlord. Thus, employment is a must. And, as Karl Polanyi points out in The Great Transformation, capitalism only functions if the unemployed are kept starving so that they immediately go out and find work. The system literally breaks down otherwise. And in this new capitalist economy, there are less and less food producers, so self-sufficiency is an option to very few. If you don't grow food, you have to labor in order to pay for it. If you don't labor, you starve. And what's worse, for the first time in human history, you have to go out and find a job. And here's the key to the whole thing. You have to be hired by an employer in order to survive. How much you get paid is determined by how well you can sell your qualifications. But it is a certainty that whatever you end up getting paid is less than you produce. If this wasn't the case, the capitalists would not hire you because they would not get anything out of doing so. The profit they make is contingent on selling your product for more than they paid you to produce it. This is Marx's surplus value. It's actually not Marx's, by the way, he stole it. The laborer takes raw materials, transforms it into a product, and then the capitalist marks up the price and sells it in the marketplace. This is a system of exploitation by definition. You can justify that exploitation if you wish, most of our society does, but it is exploitation. It's worth interjecting here to address the laughable claim that you hear from conservatives that say, burger flippers don't deserve $15 an hour. I've met a lot of liberals who sympathize with this argument as well. This is a moral judgment dressed up as an economic judgment. What they're saying is that burger flippers, the individuals, are not morally entitled to a decent living because they are considered low class. But if you were actually making an argument, saying a burger flipper doesn't deserve $15 an hour would be an absolutely absurd statement. McDonald's made $8.5 billion of operating income in the year 2017. Where does this value come from? Labor, of course. If McDonald's had doubled the pay of all of their hourly employees without raising prices, their operating income would have still been $5.5 billion. They could triple the hourly rate and still make $2.5 billion and remain one of the most profitable companies in the world. Value is created by labor, and McDonald's generates a fuck ton of value, which means that each individual laborer generates a fuck ton of value. We can call the job easy if we want, but that's not how markets work. IT people often have some of the easiest jobs on the planet and get paid high six-figure salaries for doing so. Financial investment people work a couple of hours a day moving numbers around on a computer. CEOs don't do shit and often take months worth of vacation while so-called burger flippers work 60 hours a week. We absolutely do not determine compensation by how hard someone works. If we did, the wages would be inverse in a ton of industries. In reality, wages are determined kind of by value produced and even more by social prestige. And so, in a fundamental sense, capitalism is reproducing similar mechanisms to both slavery and feudalism. The ownership class, who we sell our labor to, is extracting surplus value from us the same way masters extracted surplus value from their slaves, and lords extracted surplus value from their peasants. This is unquestionably an improved system over what preceded it, and it has to be, so that people will put up with it, of course, but the mechanism functions in the same way. And the capitalist doesn't want to just make surplus, they want to make the greatest amount of surplus possible. So I went to high school in Idaho, and a number of my peers left right after graduation to go to the oil fields in North Dakota when the industry was booming in the mini oil rush before prices dropped dramatically. And they were so proud of themselves, because unlike us college dweebs who were going into debt, they were making good money. And it was decent money. you'd have to pay me a lot more to do the jobs that they were doing in the middle of nowhere, but some of them made $100,000 or more. And they really thought they were winning. First of all, every single one of them, to a man, has been back for years, so of course not only was the oil boom unstable, but they couldn't handle doing awful work in awful conditions. But at the time, they thought they had cracked the code. Why go to college and take on debt to get some job that probably won't even be in your field when you could go make six figures? They were actually right about the first part. College is absolutely a scam, and the job market is garbage for college grads. But before knowing anything about Marx or that there was anything other than capitalism as a possibility, my first thought was about surplus value. I knew that if these people were getting paid $100K, their bosses would be making truckloads of money. And that is of course true. The CEOs of these oil companies they were working for are all billionaires. They were paying literal pocket change to these workers. And the only reason they paid $100K instead of $50K is because the conditions were so shitty, no one would have come to work for you for $50K. Hell, even if the job was in a different location, say North Carolina as a random example, they could have gotten away with paying much less. So you can probably see the direction I'm working towards at this point. Marx predicted the end of capitalism as a scientific truth because the world had seen the end of slavery and the end of feudalism. They created deeply unhappy workers who tried to escape them and then eventually overthrew them. And one of the most amazing things about capitalism, and one of the reasons why it's proven dynamic, is that it has built an entire industry around how much people hate it. These are, of course, exploitative commodities on their own, but they serve the function of the system at large. Why are cities filled with hundreds of restaurants, the bulk of which are corporate and microwave pre-frozen food? Because that is our escape. We plan our whole lives around that chunk of time we spend not sleeping and not working, which is increasingly shrinking, by the way. It's amazing to look at the charts of time spent working per week over time. These numbers are even worse than they look, because in the past the way that work was defined was shady. But what you see is the number of hours decline steadily from 1870 until about 1940, and then they rise back up. We still talk about the 40-hour work week, but it's basically irrelevant at this point. The average American male works 45.75 hours per week, and the average American female works 42.55 hours per week. And of course, this only counts labor that is commodified, not child rearing, for example, unless you're doing it for somebody else's child. So this little gap of time between your sleep, your get ready time, and your 9-hour workday is what most of us live for. This gap of time is literally where the term happy hour comes from, and that couldn't be more fitting. Here's this brief window where you get to enjoy yourself. Then you must rejuvenate for the next day of labor. So Marx correctly predicted that people would become fed up with the system and its contradictions. That any system based on exploitation, in which someone takes the surplus value of the workers and distributes it among non-workers, would eventually collapse under its own weight. Just as slavery was weakened by revolts, and a very quick side note, please think about slavery here as an economic system that existed outside of the United States. The US system was essentially a vestige that existed after capitalism had emerged, which is why American slavery is so uniquely heinous. Just as feudalism collapsed after war and disease and escape and eventual overthrow, most notably the French Revolution, so too will capitalism one day be overthrown. When that is becomes the big question, not if it's going to happen. Optimists argue that capitalism's contradictions have been heightened to such a great extent and that its inability to escape these massively disruptive recessions every 5 to 8 years will lead to its collapse in the very near future. Others argue that capitalism is still relatively young, only a couple hundred years old, and that just like slavery and feudalism lasted centuries, so will capitalism. This is just an impossible argument to parse, especially because we're living in a new dawn in which, for the first time in human history, the life of each generation is dramatically different than the one before it. As Yuval Harari points out in his book Sapiens, which for those of you who heed my recommendations is a must-read, it has consistently been the case throughout human history that your child's life is going to look nearly identical to yours. The food, the culture, the job market, the family, gender relations, the government, these things were pretty much locked in. Now, that's been completely subverted. Theoretically, this should mean that capitalism could be overthrown in 20 years, never to return. but it can also be used as a powerful tool with which capitalists cement their dominance. Look at the rise of surveillance capitalism, for example. And look at what Andrew Yang's presidential campaign is trying to do right now. Yang wants to give everyone a baseline of literally just enough to stay alive in a commodified economy, and then phase out the welfare state and automate everything. His goal is literally to keep capitalism persisting through the UBI rather than creating a new economic system. And there are a lot of people who are receptive to this proposal. Really think about this. Think about the term automation crisis. Only in capitalism does an increase in efficiency lead to a crisis in the economy and an economic downturn. A socialist system would automate as much as possible and use it to lessen the burden of human work time. But capitalism has to have high employment in order to function. As David Graeber points out in his book Bullshit Jobs, this means we go to the furthest lengths possible to create completely unnecessary labor. Again, only in capitalism can an increase in efficiency hurt the economy. Alright, so now we get to the good shit. I'm sorry if you were just here for a very narrow definition of socialism, but I feel like that context is vital. And obviously that was a Reader's Digest version. There's a reason why just volume 1 of Das Kapital is 1,000 pages. It's very complex. You should also know when you hear my voice that I'm Mr. Tangent, and so there's that too. Some of you like my rambling brain, and some of you don't. And that's okay, comrades. So if the problem that is supposed to lead to the end of capitalism is the exploitation and theft of surplus value, then the solution is pretty obvious, right? The thing that socialism is attempting to do is to take back that surplus value such that workers own the means of production. That's it. There's a lot of theory that goes beyond that, but that's why pretty much every leftist calls themselves a socialist first and then their next descriptor second. So, for example, anarchists usually call themselves socialists. They just aren't state socialists. Mutualists, Marxist-Leninists, Trotskyites, anarcho-syndicalists, left libertarians, communists, Maoists, all these sects and the million different iterations between them are socialists because they believe that workers should own the means of production. In a capitalist system, a worker sells their labor to an owner, transforms raw materials into a finished product for some level of compensation, and then the owner marks up the price and makes a profit off that finished product. In a socialist system, when the raw material is transformed into a finished product, the worker who transformed it keeps all of the value, or at least as much of it as possible. In true, genuine, post-revolutionary socialism, there is no profit because profit is the material outcome of exploitation. But of course, socialism is a sliding scale in the real world. I want to stop to address something here that apparently is going to become a talking point of the Bernie Sanders campaign that is very ill-advised and you should push back against. It's a cute turn of phrase, and it sounds good as a punchline, but it's actually really destructive to spreading a leftist message. The Sanders campaign is essentially making the case for the old Martin Luther King line you've probably heard that it's socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. Again, good punchline. But if you try to extend that as you actually make the case for socialism, it fails. For one, it's just very confusing. I'm a socialist and so are rich people, but they're just socialists for themselves? That's very weird messaging. Our goal is to spread the message that socialism is good, so equating it with the capitalist class makes little sense. Secondly, it reinforces the idea that capitalism is a fine system, it has just been deeply distorted. This is the belief of Elizabeth Warren, and it's fundamentally wrong. Of course, it's better than people who think that capitalism is great, but so much of what we identify as capitalism's wrongs are it working as it was intended. So, for example, you'll often hear that capitalism isn't cutting it for working people because the rich have hoarded all the wealth and inequality is rising. That's true, of course, but that's a feature, not a bug. That's how the system is supposed to work. There's nothing inherent to capitalism that says you should care about your workers. In fact, quite the opposite. Your goal is to exploit them as much as humanly possible. The only line you can't cross in terms of exploitation is to go so far they won't come back to work anymore. The meager social safety net that we have, one, came about literally because socialist and communist and labor unions demanded it, and two, has been maintained only because the ruling class knows that if it did away with it, the system would collapse in revolutionary fervor. That's why they chip away at it ever so slowly, so that they can continue to squeeze more and more out of you. But they don't just get rid of food stamps altogether tomorrow. Why? I promise it's not because the Republican Party gives a fuck. They would be happy to do so if capital demanded it. It's because a big chunk of workers have come to rely on food stamps, and if you're Walmart, it's the perfect balance. Add a fraction of a penny on your tax dollar to have a workforce that is fed by government so that you can continue to pay them $7.25 an hour. And I understand the whole socialism for the rich thing, but Bernie is describing capitalism. The point of capitalism is that the ownership class decides how to distribute surplus value. This means they're going to take care of their needs no matter what. And of course they're going to spend a chunk of that surplus value to control the decision making of the state so that they can get tax breaks and friendly land deals. That's how the system works. It's not socialism, it's capitalism by the book. Okay, so it's worth talking about the history of socialism, just like we talked about the history of capitalism. How has it worked in the real world? Basically, there are broadly 3 forms of experiments that have been tried, all to differing levels of success. First, you have the kind of socialism that Bernie Sanders brings forth as an example when he talks about his kind of socialism. Bernie likes to talk about the Nordic countries, and for obvious reasons. The easiest example of leftism in the world today is Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These are what are called social democracies. The way that some have described them is capitalism with a smiley face. The distinction here gets kind of tricky. When does a country become socialist? Is France socialist? No, very few would say they are. Why not? There is more public ownership in the means of production in France than there is in Venezuela, by quite a bit. In fact, the United States only has 2% less public ownership than Venezuela. Are we 2% less socialist? So some of you might be asking then, why is Venezuela called socialist at all? There are 2 reasons for this. 1, for conservatives, freedom equals capitalism, and authoritarianism equals socialism. It's as simple as that. I brought this up in a previous podcast, but there's this incredible moment when Ben Shapiro is at a college owning the libs with facts and logic, and a knowledgeable socialist brings up the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which is a worker-owned cooperative in which the profits are entirely returned to the employees. I think I've seen some recent articles about Mondragon changing a bit in recent years, but at least at its inception, it was a pure workers' co-op that didn't have surplus value. It also happened to be an incredibly successful company, like one of the most successful in all of Spain. And research shows workers' co-op dominate capitalist enterprises in production because it turns out when people actually receive the value of their labor, they work a lot harder. And when decisions are made democratically, they tend to be more effective. Anyways, Shapiro's response to how this business could be an example of a socialist enterprise and still be effective was to say that because there was free association, it wasn't socialist.
So we need to be very specific. When you talk about the ownership of the means of production, are you talking about my version, because that's called capitalism, or are you talking about where the government owns the means of production or crams down on voluntary associations' rules as to the means of production?
I'm talking about neither. I reject state socialism personally. What I'm referring to is specifically, for example, the term given is worker cooperatives. The most prominent example, the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, owned there is no investor or capitalist group that owns the profits. When the company turns a profit, that profit is distributed among the workers, some 80,000 employees. It's a wildly successful corporation.
I mean, is it a voluntary association? Is there any cram down happening?
No, there's not.
Then good. It's capitalist. That's not socialist.
In other words, to Shapiro, socialism is when the government holds a gun to your head and forces you to do something. Everything else is capitalism. The second reason that Venezuela is called socialist is because it has a president who calls himself a socialist. And theoretically, you could say that if you have a socialist government, you are a socialist country, but François Hollande was president of France from 2012 to 2017. He was a member of the Socialist Party. Was France socialist for 5 years and now it's not anymore because Macron is president? Likewise, if Bernie Sanders wins the election in 2020, does that make America a socialist country thereafter? Okay, a little off topic, but these debates are the ones you're going to constantly hear in the media, and probably from people in your personal life who parrot them, so it's good to have a grasp. Back to the 3 kinds. So you have social democracy. This is a murky form of socialism, but a form of socialism nonetheless. And it's been pretty successful. The Nordic countries have a highly functioning, cradle-to-grave welfare state. The government owns most sectors of the economy, which it considers to be antithetical to the profit motive, and it didn't have a bloody revolution to get there. It's a reformist kind of socialism, in which you continue to expand public ownership through the ballot box as far as you possibly can. The problem is, and this was theorized by Rosa Luxemburg all the way back in 1899, reforms will be rolled back over time if you don't put in place a mechanism to stop it from happening. Luxemburg's famous book was titled Reform or Revolution, but the "or" part of the title was really tongue-in-cheek. She was saying, of course we should advocate for reforms like single-payer healthcare and free college education. But if we don't have revolution in mind, i.e. the working class actually taking over the state, the remaining capitalist sector of the economy will take back its power and roll back reform over time. Luxemburg has shown to be spot on. This is true in the United States, certainly. Although we never had strong reforms to begin with, the US has slowly but surely gutted social protections. We just officially passed the longest period of time between minimum wage increases, and our current wage of $7.25 is hardly enough for people to be able to afford rent working 40 hours a week, let alone feed themselves. Social security payments also haven't kept up with inflation, and the retirement age continues to be increased as Republicans are considering doing again today. One of our most important welfare programs, aid to families with dependent children, was repealed under the Bill Clinton administration with the backing of Joe Biden in 1996. But we're not alone. The Nordic countries have undergone neoliberal reforms as well. The best example is Sweden, which had a strong and growing social democracy, and who some predicted were on their way to something approximating a form of full public ownership of the means of production, until they instituted neoliberal reforms in the 1990s. They privatized and cut social safety nets, and put a quash on experiments to take the next steps in public ownership. So social democracies have shown themselves to be decent places to live, especially when they elect members of the Socialist Party who looked after the needs of the working class. These countries have decommodified a lot of industry and put in place things like public pension funds, the profits of which are distributed equally among the population. They've also shown to be fickle and susceptible to rollbacks, such that it's not difficult to envision a Sweden in which the new moderates win a couple elections in a row and Sweden begins to look more like Germany, i.e. capitalism with a middling welfare state. So that's the first kind of socialism. The second kind of socialism looks at the first kind and recognizes its weaknesses as twofold. The first is what we just discussed. The private sector is always going to produce extremely powerful people who are willing to do whatever it takes to fight their reforms and push for more liberalization. Imagine if Bernie Sanders became president and implemented everything that he has advocated for, and even a little more. Let's say we nationalized oil and had public banking and a cradle-to-grave welfare state that provided for people's healthcare, food, and retirement needs. We paid for all this by rolling back American empire and taxing the wealthy at rates of 95% on income over $10 million. Well, pharmaceutical executives and oil company CEOs wouldn't exist in such a system, because their industries would be nationalized, but Jeff Bezos would still be around selling products on Amazon, and he would still have a ton of political power and relative wealth even with the 95% tax on every dollar he made over $10 million. So he's still going to play a role. Every waking moment of his life is going to be spent trying to bribe politicians and fund organizations to try to reduce his taxes and allow him to take home more profit. The other objection these socialists have to social democracy is that even if we could get Jeff Bezos to not influence our government through a strong regulatory framework, he is still going to use his business to exploit people. Privately run businesses exist for the purpose of exploiting their workers, and as such are antithetical to socialism. Thus, the solution to the flaws of social democracy is to take over the whole enterprise. The government should abolish private property in total so that we eliminate the profit motive entirely and end exploitation and the stealing of surplus value. This is what we call a planned economy. They see an economic system run on market signals as one that by definition produces scarcity because that's the way in which it makes a profit. So to eliminate all forms of exploitation, the government centrally plans and allocates resources. As listeners almost certainly know, this describes Lenin and Stalin in the Soviet Union, as well as Mao's China. We all know about the failure and atrocities of these regimes, though to say that they are all bad would be silly. Like I stated earlier, the rise of Russia from a backwater to a fully industrialized war machine in the span of a couple decades is one of the most impressive accomplishments of the 20th century. And this was done with constant external aggression, including the United States invading Russia in 1920 and attempting to subvert its revolutionary government. Further, those of you who have listened to my podcast on Fidel Castro will know that Cuba had impressive accomplishments despite the fact that the US attempted to destroy its economy by blocking sugar exports. Cuba was far from anyone's description of perfect, but if you look at the spike in literacy rates, land distribution, and healthcare provisions, it's impossible to say these things are bad unless you're a rich person who had their land expropriated. The infant mortality rate remains much higher in the US than it is in Cuba today. And one of Cuba's primary exports is doctors to help in crises around the world because Cuba's medical system is so exceptional for its size and its resources. I also have to throw in the fact that Fidel Castro is the single biggest reason apartheid ended in South Africa outside of Nelson Mandela himself, and I consider that to be as an important accomplishment as any. So we have to be nuanced thinkers about these things. If you're a tankie that defends Stalin's gulags, then I don't consider you an ally. But also, if you buy into right-wing propaganda that Fidel Castro is a murderous dictator who didn't help the Cuban people, I also think you're dumb. It's not an either-or. But it shouldn't be surprising to us as leftists that when a government takes all industry, there's a huge opportunity for vast amounts of repression and murder. I'm distrustful of Stalin just like I'm distrustful of Obama, just like I'm distrustful of Mandela, just like I'm distrustful of Emmanuel Macron. Anybody wielding state power should make you nervous by default, including Bernie Sanders. This motherfucker said the Obama drone program was a good thing, i.e. he consented to the killing of civilians in countries we as citizens are unaware of by a big shadowy organization with no transparency. So anyways, this is where the Bolsheviks start calling themselves communists. They initially called themselves Social Democrats after the German Social Democratic Party and then Socialists, but communist was the label they used to differentiate themselves from reformist and signal that they wanted to take government control of all industry and institute a centrally planned economy. I would argue these communist states ran into two major problems. The first I mentioned earlier is transitioning too early. That Karl Marx guy was pretty smart, and he wasn't just basically speculating when he envisioned socialism being a transition that took place after industrialization. We can say that hierarchies and division of labor are unethical, but we can't say that they aren't effective at achieving certain tasks. Marx certainly would not have said that. And one of those tasks is industrialization. The most disgusting atrocities of Mao and Stalin came when they were trying to centrally plan mass industrial production. The second issue, and non-leftists hate it when we bring this up as an, quote, excuse, but it's an empirical reality, is that the international capitalist system combated communist countries at every step of the way. It's really hard to have a productive economy when you're being sabotaged by the West. The US tried to assassinate Fidel Castro hundreds of times and cut off his exports. We've assassinated and overthrown communist leaders throughout Latin America and the Middle East. We fought a Cold War with Russia and did everything we could to cripple them economically. We had proxy wars with China. The reason capitalism is so powerful in its alternative struggle around the world is because capitalism is reinforced by an entire global network of open markets. Literally strength in numbers. So then we have a third basic model of socialism that attempts a synthesis of the first two. It's an idea that's been tried on a small, non-state scale and is being pushed on a state scale now by socialists who don't think Bernie's social democratic model goes nearly far enough, but understand the pitfalls of communism and consolidation of power. I would argue that communes are an example of this in a limited form, and certainly democratic cooperatives like the Mandragon Corporation are as well. Its most famous advocate is Richard Wolff, but Bhaskar Sankara of Jacobin, Nathan J. Robinson of Current Affairs have also advocated a similar approach. There are many others, but these are some of the big names. It's also the core tenet of the biggest socialist organization in the country. And this form of socialism is called democratic socialism. This is confusing if you're a follower of Bernie Sanders because this is the title that he gives himself, but what he actually advocates is social democracy. So what is democratic socialism? Well, the place to begin is that it starts in the workplace. What good is having Joseph Stalin lead the country if the planned economy that he puts in place is just as exploitative as capitalism? Is socialism really worth fighting for if there's going to be no freedom in what I do when I go to work for 8 hours a day? And doesn't this violate the very purpose of socialism, i.e. public ownership of the means of production? Public does not mean government unless that government represents the public. I don't really own my labor if the product all goes to the Soviet state and they get to decide what I get back, do I? In addition, what does it really mean to live in a democracy? In the United States, the word democracy has been contorted to mean exactly one thing: suffrage. When you first heard me say the word democracy in this podcast, you almost certainly thought of the voting booth. We think of America as a small d democratic society. Why? Because every 2 years we get to pick our House member, every 4 we get to pick the president, and every 6 we get to pick our senator. But that's a pretty narrow and limited view of democracy, isn't it? Is that the most control we can have over our lives? We get 1 day to vote every few years on the people who will decide how our entire socio-political and economic system as well as our foreign policy functions? If you really step back and consider how little control that leaves people, it becomes pretty clear that it's not just not a democratic system, it's an anti-democratic system. It's built to give us just enough say that we feel like we're doing something and won't revolt without ever actually letting us make key decisions. And that's exactly how the Founding Fathers intended it. America is cast as this great democratic project. It absolutely wasn't. Read Madison. Read the Federalist Papers. Do you think it's a mistake that the Senate, which until the 17th Amendment was literally not even voted on, got more power and power without balance? What are the unique privileges of the House of Representatives? It basically has one. It gets to originate spending bills. This isn't entirely insignificant. For example, the Affordable Care Act would have looked a lot different had it originated in the Senate, and it's hard to amend a bill that's 2,000 pages long. So there's some power in originating spending bills. But it's nothing compared to the advise and consent role of the Senate that gets to approve the entire presidential cabinet and gets to vote on the picks of the Supreme Court, which is also unelected and which has the final say over all legislation, which, by the way, is relatively unique to the United States. This wasn't done on accident either. The Senate was explicitly designed with 6-year terms, 4 years longer than the House, to, quote, control the whims of the public, as the founders put it. So that even if the public decided in a huff they were sick of not having health care, you'd have protected senators who, again, weren't elected by the founders' design to stifle that from happening. That's not democracy, and not even close. The word democracy comes from the Greek word demos and kratia. Demos means the people, and kratia means rule. The people rule. And one of Marx's core theses, as an economist, is that democracy doesn't extend to the workplace in any country on earth. Each country has varying levels of say in their government, but none has active say in what they do all day long. Isn't that where democracy matters the most? Yeah, it's fine for representatives to debate whether gay marriage should be recognized by the state and which drugs should be kept illegal, but the relationship that really defines one's life is their production. Drug policy and post office funding and infrastructure spending impact some people some of the time, but basically all of the people work almost every day. The demos can't rule over the decision making of a society if that rule doesn't extend to the workplace, period. And so even in a communist system, say the Democratic Socialists, where we pick a perfectly benevolent leader that meets all of our healthcare, funding, and housing needs, workers should still play a role in deciding what they produce and for whom. And luckily, for the Democratic Socialists, the evidence is on their side. Worker-owned businesses have unequivocally shown to be the most effective way to organize production that we currently know of. Another quick tangent here, and I'll try to make it my last. Some of you who are YouTube watchers or Twitch users, which I imagine is a decent portion of you, may have heard of the streamer Destiny. He's a liberal who primarily debates the alt-right on topics like race realism and immigration restrictionism. He's definitely not a leftist, even though a ton of his fans are. So he recently caused a huge wave of drama because he said that socialists are stupid because they glorify workers and workers are dumb. And there are two misconceptions here that are worth addressing, because you'll probably hear this line of argumentation at some point. The first point is that workers seemingly aren't dumb because workers' co-op produce astounding results in terms of how they allocate resources. This is not to say that managers aren't important or skilled, but they are often disconnected from the entire chain of production. It would make sense that individual workers know the most about each micro step in the production process because they do those tasks all day long. Not only does it make intuitive sense, it seems to be what the evidence shows. And by the way, co-ops generally work in a system of localized representation, so you have a decent amount of people in the room making decisions, but it's not like all 85,000 Montreal employees show up to each meeting. That's not how it works. You elect a leader to represent your certain branch of the industry, and of course you have constant input in how they go and represent you. And they can be booted from office if they don't represent you fairly. There's a theory in the social sciences that has been tested time and time again and yielded consistent results called wisdom of the crowds. This theory argues that the aggregate knowledge of any group of people will exceed that of individual members of that group. Essentially, the more people making the decision, the more likely that decision is to be right. So if you had to guess how many marbles are in a jar, the more people who have input into that guess, the more likely they are to be correct. I think this theory applies to workers in production as well, in an even more applied sense. Basically, I'm just saying, it's no accident co-ops perform consistently better than traditional businesses. And these effects will multiply across the entire economy because there are a lot of shitty top-down bosses out there who make horrible decisions. Secondly, one of the biggest benefits to a worker co-op model is that, across the board, workers tend to enjoy their job more when they are fairly compensated and when they have a personal stake. So in a co-op, you own part of the business, so you have a stake in the business doing well. This goes beyond just your pocketbook though, obviously. This helps to build community and means you're infinitely more likely to enjoy the job you do every day. And then the final point to make on Destiny's workers are dumb take is that the system is going to change dramatically under socialism across the board. There's no world in which workers control the means of their production, but education isn't free and accessible. So yes, capitalism creates a lot of dumb workers who are poorly educated, who might have mental health issues because they eat like shit and don't exercise and have no access to healthcare, who are anxious about their economic precarity, who have shitty consumer goods constantly shoved down their throats to keep them persistently distracted. This is not to say that socialism means that everybody is smart and productive, but it is to say that certainly a shit ton more people will be as society's incentives change. If you don't think capitalism produces a garbage culture, then you have absolutely no grasp of the world around you. You see this today among the Nordic social democracies, who finish, no pun intended, among the top 10 across any measure of education you can find. Another example is Soviet Russia. Ignore the regime and its behavior. When you're reading about the population and how many people were engaged with theory and politics at such a highly sophisticated manner, coming from a backwards country whose education system was previously horrific, it's pretty spectacular. As the mood started to sour on the Soviet Union after World War II and turned towards China, what you'll find if you read accounts of basically anyone who went there at the time is that the Russian people were just incredibly engaged and active and dedicated. So the key to this synthesized form of democratic socialism is a bottom-up approach instead of a top-down approach. Both social democracy and communism leave the fate of society up to the government. Theoretically, in a communist system, the government is a true representation of the people, but obviously that is not proven to be the case. Democratic socialism says that the way we reach the definitional end goal of worker ownership of the means of production is to literally take over the means of production at the workplace. But this, of course, leaves a lot of questions to be answered. How do we take over the corporations and make the co-ops in the first place? Do these co-ops continue to exist in a market system? How do they relate with one another? And, if successful across the United States, how do they then relate with foreign countries? I think the most logical progression for those of you who will listen to this and then try to work out your own idea of transformation in your head is to borrow from all three forms of socialism. And obviously there are a million different strands of leftism who foolishly spend their time bickering back and forth online rather than fighting capitalism. But in the broadest sense, for most of the leftist community, who understand the basics but don't dive into theory, think about the way in which these systems can work together. This emerging form of democratic socialism is very enticing, and it's also very achievable in terms of starting. There are already co-ops in the United States, and labor unions who do organizing on a similar line. Even just radicalizing labor unions and convincing them that cooperatives are good is a powerful start. But I think it's quite obvious that you can't just co-opt yourself to full ownership of the means of production. We can have as many general strikes as we like, but Jeff Bezos isn't going to give Amazon over. So combine your tactics. To illustrate what I'm talking about here, I want to discuss what was called the Meidner Plan in Sweden. The Meidner Plan was proposed in 1951 and taken up by labor in 1971 by two researchers at the Swedish Trade Union Confederation. And it had a number of planks that it put forth. It wanted low inflation, full employment, high growth, and income equality. So to achieve this, it began by putting forth a proposal for industry standards to fair compensation, where the floor was set at which companies in the industry were most fairly compensating their workers. And this was to be stacked on top of reforms from the state, which guaranteed wage floors and regulated buybacks and rent seeking. So if, in the construction industry, there's a company that is very efficient and pays its average roofer $50 an hour, then all construction companies across the industry would be required to pay that $50 an hour under the Meidner Plan. If you can't pay your workers the average industry standards, you don't get to be a construction company anymore. But, surprise, surprise, this happens very rarely because businesses are built on the exploitation of labor. The Meidner Plan also created wage earner funds that demanded that each company give at least 20% of its profits back to employees in stock options each year. Workers would negotiate to increase that 20% that was guaranteed by government until they eventually became majority shareholders in the company and have the majority say in decision making. The Meidner Plan also demanded full employment. So the Meidner Plan serves as a limited form of the way you mix these plans together to achieve the ultimate objective. Let's take the UK, for example. Jeremy Corbyn is a social democrat, like Bernie, in terms of his logistical plan of what he can do as prime minister, but his actual politics are pretty clearly to the left of Bernie. He's a legit radical who thinks that all foreign wars, except for in the most extreme circumstances, are immoral, for example. And in Corbyn, you see him grappling with how he can be a social democratic prime minister who works alongside labor to go further in their democratic socialism. So the Labor Manifesto, which lays out what a labor government plans to do if Corbyn takes office, puts forth a very good plan, which would give workers first say in buying a corporation that was about to sell. So an owner wants to sell his corporation for a certain price that would, by the way, be legally regulated by the state at a fair market rate. Before that corporation sells, the workers can get together and see if they are interested in pooling their money together to buy the business first. Corbyn also wants to partially nationalize the banking sector such that there are public banks under the purview of the state that have a government mandate to act in the best interest of their patrons. These employees could take on a loan if they needed to as an organized body and pay it off through production. So think about what happens here. In Corbyn's ideal world, you have a massive emerging workers' movement that is being collectivized and building solidarity through ownership of the workplace. He wants them to go beyond just what he is pushing through Parliament to take as much ownership and power as possible. Meanwhile, he wants to nationalize certain industries and expand social safety nets and raise taxes and even put in place a maximum wage. He wants to create a national education service, just like the UK has a national health service. He wants rent controls, increased pension funding, and free public transportation. So what is the result if Corbyn gets all that he wants? It's a three-pronged attack borrowing from all three forms of socialism. On the one hand, you build a strong welfare state that takes care of the population's basic needs from cradle to grave. That's social democracy. Then you go a step further by taking important industries that shouldn't be making profits out of the marketplace and nationalizing them such that they are centrally planned. This borrows from communism. Finally, you empower workers to own their production and democratize the workforce. You give them the tools and the power to take the next step. This borrows from all three strands of socialism, but most heavily leans on the third one, democratic socialism. Because if Corbyn is elected, and everything were to go to plan, which obviously is a tall order, but not an impossible one, especially if the British proletariat never stops making demands, the end result is a very left-wing social democracy, but one that has the potential to become whatever workers want it to be. you're not left with just a vulnerable regulatory state or totalitarian leadership, but instead with a bunch of workers who are largely collectivized and who have legitimate power to make the demands they so choose. And then you've created a socialism that is dynamic and flexible, which I believe to be the one thing that capitalism is best at and the reason it has persisted as long as it has. So that's an overview of socialism, Trevor style, replete with my tangents and some of my personal perspective. I'll finish the podcast by saying that I'm no expert, and even if I was an expert, you shouldn't just take my word for it. I listen to a range of leftist podcasts, some to the right of me and some to the left of me, who would mock me as infantile if they heard this, and that's fine. That's just the way it works on the left. Everyone seems to think that everyone else is fundamentally misguided, which is what you'd expect from smart people dealing with an infinitely complex topic. Remember, we're discussing the way our economy is structured here. Modes of production are not something to be taken lightly. I'll end with this. It's important that we discuss these things and try to hash them out to the extent that we can before we take action. There are certain things that leftists believe that are truly in contradiction. But that said, as leftists, we believe 95% of the same things. Further, as Marx's theory of history tells us, a post-revolution society is going to be almost entirely determined by the material conditions that exist at the time. So most of this bickering back and forth will be futile. And it must always be remembered, at this point in time, our primary and really only goal is to fight back against the exploitative and self-destructive system of capitalism that robs us of our mental health, our physical well-being, and our freedom.